I have noticed a lot of comments regarding the recent visit of President Bashar al-Assad to the United Arab Emirates, UAE, and a lot of questions have been posed or posted on social media platforms, especially on Syrian analysis, regarding the UAE's relationship with Israel and how could this influence or affect Syria's rapprochement with the UAE. Now, there are some commentators, they said since the UAE has normalized relations with Israel, that means Syria will normalize relations with Israel, or Syria has already normalized relations but tacitly under the table. In my opinion, in this video, I'm just telling you some of them, my opinion, and some of them how could the decision makers in Damascus could be thinking of, because of my experience during the past 10 years when I was following the Syrian war, and also how the Syrian leadership was thinking during the Lebanese civil war, right? So I have gathered some experience in this regard, and I think I may know how the decision makers in Damascus are thinking. So first of all, in my opinion, this is a very simplistic and childish claim that if the UAE normalizes relations with with Israel, that means Damascus will normalize also relations with Israel. Now, in my opinion, the United Arab Emirates, they wish Syria to normalize relations with Israel. And this also goes for Russia, by the way. However, a strategic decision of this sort and on this level can only be taken, in my opinion, in Damascus and not in Abu Dhabi and not in Moscow. Although Moscow and Abu Dhabi are trying to persuade or convince Syria maybe to sign on a peace deal with Israel, I don't think this decision it can be made in Moscow or in Abu Dhabi, as I mentioned, let alone that these countries can persuade or convince Syria to take such a step. Because a decision of this sort will have strategic repercussions, implications on the entire Middle Eastern geography. And it will have a direct impact on the security situation in Syria, the future of Syria's role in the region, and how Syria could play any regional role in the future. So all this has to be taken into consideration, and also the future of the Golan Heights, the Palestinian rights of return, the lines of 4th of June 1967 war, etc. I will explain this information to you in a later stage. Now, among other Arab states, there are, for example, Egypt and Jordan. They have already normalized relations with Israel, right? Egypt in 1978 and Jordan in 1994. They were called the Camp David Accords and Wadi Araba Agreement. And despite the normalization of Cairo and Amman with Israel, the Syrian relationship with these countries and Syria's role in the region on the foreign policy level, especially when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, hasn't changed. Syria was not affected, or Syria didn't change its position because Jordan and Egypt changed their positions, although Syria was gravely influenced or damaged by the Egyptian withdrawal from the Arab-Israeli conflict, and Syria stayed alone in this for at least a few decades. Now, there is another point of importance is a lot of people are pointing out that there is a growing dissatisfaction in Syria, a popular dissatisfaction, because of the miserable economic situation, right? And that's true. And there are also people asking questions. They're saying, why would we pay all this big and huge price for our principles and for our principled foreign policy regarding the Middle Eastern situation, especially the Israeli conflict, when we are the only ones paying all this big price? Of course, this is a legitimate question. People could ask this question, especially if you're not finding bread for your child or milk for your infant, right? And you know that your country has paid a huge price because of a foreign policy approach or foreign policy choices. So some people would say, okay, enough is enough. Let's do a peace deal maybe with Israel if that means our economic situation will get better. But in my opinion, this is just a emotional reaction to a very severe situation in Syria by these people. And of course, I'm not blaming them, because who am I to judge? They are the ones who live in this very dire situation. But this growing dissatisfaction, the main root of it, the main cause, is the economic factor. If the economic factor is improved in Syria, especially with this reopening of the relationship with the Gulf states, with the UAE, and maybe later with Saudi Arabia, if the economic situation gets better in Syria and people feel relieved once again, this radical approach that they have taken, that enough is enough, we don't want to be in this conflict because of the Palestinians or because of the Golan Heights, let us first secure food and bread and medicine, and later we think about geopolitics, right? This will be slowly vanished. This is in my opinion. Secondly, even if the economic situation hasn't improved, when there is an attempt by the Syrian army, for example, to shoot down an Israeli fighter jet, whether over the skies of Syria or even from Lebanon or the Golan Heights, when they're trying to bomb Syria on a regular basis, the morals always become high, the public opinion changes, and let alone if there was a limited confrontation, for example, whether limited or not, between Israel or Syria, this could again change the public opinion in favor of the foreign policies of Syria in the region. This is in my humble opinion. Now, some may ask, so then what, Kev? Will Syria sign or not? Is this the possibility or not? I would like first to go a little bit into history, because we need to get the entire context when we talk about these issues, right? So Syria is technically in war with Israel since 1948. When Israel was created, Syria was engaged in a war with Israel in 1948 war. And later, in 1967, Israel attacked Syria and Egypt, and Israel has occupied a large swath of territories, including the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and also most of the territories from Palestine, right? Later in 1973, when Hafez al-Assad and Anwar Sadat, they planned to restore these stolen territories or occupied territories. So in 1973, they launched a war. It was called Yom Kippur War, in order to capture this territory. Syria was only successful in capturing Al-Qunaytira area, and the Golan Heights stayed with Israel. Egypt, on the other hand, restored the Sinai Peninsula with peace talks with Israel, right? In exchange for the Sinai Peninsula will be a demilitarized zone. Egypt cannot send heavy artilleries or weaponry into the Sinai, so it is like a buffer zone between Egypt and Israel, and of course other security arrangements. Syria refused to sign on a peace deal with Israel because Syria said that you cannot hold singular agreements with Israel. We should come into a comprehensive peace agreement that includes all the files and not separately. Hafez al-Assad always said, when we do separate agreements with Israel, we will negotiate in a position of a weak. We are in a weak position when we negotiate singularly. So let's do a collective negotiation. Let's solve the Syrian Golan Heights issue with Israel. Let's solve the Egyptian problem. Let's solve the Jordanian problem, and let's solve the Palestinian problem, all in one basket. And that's how Syria could be engaged in talks. Now, this was after the 73 war, right? Then in 82, when Syria was involved in the Lebanese civil war, with the invitation of the Lebanese government in order to stop the civil war there, Syria and Israel were engaged, or have been engaged also, in heavy confrontations on the Lebanese territories. And Israel was occupying southern Lebanon, right? From 82 till 2000. So there was also a clash between Syria and Israel in this regard. Then a major development, international development happened, which is the fall of the Soviet Union. And since Syria was an ally for the Soviet Union, it suddenly found itself in an international community without an international backer or international supporter, right? Such as the Soviet Union, which was protecting, let's say, Syria and giving Syria or supplying Syria with weapons, etc. And Syria was in a very dire economic situation. They were really in a bad economic situation. So back then in 1991, first of all, Syria, because of the fall of the Soviet Union, they said, okay, they started to ease their position regarding the United States, especially because they don't want to anger the United States when they don't have a Soviet Union in their back, right? So they engaged in, or they sent some troops on the borders with Iraq when the United States was bombing Iraq in 1990 or 1991, the second Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So back then, the tacit deal was, okay, Syria would give it's okay for bombing Iraq in 1991 because of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. In exchange, the Americans would promise Syria that they're not going to overthrow the Syrian government, and two, they will play an objective, neutral role or a mediator role between Israel and Syria in order to make a peace deal between both sides and restore the Golan Heights to Syria. So this was the Madrid Conference in 1991, right? In a later stage, of course, the Madrid Conference didn't succeed. In 1991 till 2000, again, Syria was engaged in indirect or direct peace talks with Israel in the United States in Shepherdstown. And back then, the foreign minister of Syria, Farouk Shara, attended this meeting. I think it was Ehud Barak back then, when the talks started between the both sides. Again, it didn't succeed. In 2000, it was the withdrawal of the Israeli forces from Lebanon with a huge military help from Syria to the armed resistance groups in Lebanon in order to kick out the Israeli forces from Lebanon. And that was the liberation of southern Lebanon. Then we had a very difficult time in the Middle East between 2000 and 2006. First of all, 9/11, which led to the invasion of Afghanistan and the war on terror in the entire Middle East. And the United States labeled Syria as from the axis of evil. So Syria was like turned back on itself, isolated itself, and started to feel like it's threatened. Then the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Syria knew that Syria is next on the hit list, right? So they were also very nervous in Damascus in 2003, and they supported lots of groups in Iraq in order to keep the United States busy in this conflict in Iraq. And finally, in 2005, it was the assassination of the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafi al-Hariri, and the accusation of the US, France, Britain, and other Western countries to Syria that it has assassinated Rafi al-Hariri, and they started to sanction Syria. They created a special tribunal to investigate the case of the assassination, and until this moment, they don't have any evidence, and I think they just closed this tribunal as well. In 2006, later, it was the war between Lebanon and Israel. Israel invaded Lebanon, and Syria opened all its stockpiles to the Lebanese Hezbollah, and they managed to kick out Israel again from southern Lebanon. So 2006, it was over. Syria was very, let's say, in a very strong position in the region. It felt like it has managed to defeat Israel through Hezbollah, right? In 2008, Syria felt in a position of power, and they again engaged in indirect talks with Israel, with the Turkish mediation this time, and the talks were in Ankara, I think. And again, at the last moment, it failed again. And let me remind you what Ehud Olmert, back then he was the Prime Minister of Israel, he said, this was just a few months ago, I think on Russia Today, English or Arabic, that if President Bashar al-Assad signed on a treaty with Israel before 2011, there wouldn't have been a war in Syria. Like, I'm just paraphrasing him. So it was also a tacit confession that Israel has played a role in triggering the war against Syria in 2011. Then the war started, the 2011, and you can see it's been already 11, 12 years. It's a very devastating situation, and Israel is involved in this war on the sides of the so-called rebels, right? Even al-Nusra Front and ISIS in southern Syria, especially in al-Qunayjira and al-Dar'a, they were hand in hand, and Israel was giving them cash and medical support and intelligence support. And this is all well documented fact. So the question is, when is the right time for Syria to normalize relations with Israel? The first question I would ask, is Syria interested in peace talks with Israel? Do they believe that Israel is serious in a peace talk in the first place? This is number one. Number two, even if Syria is convinced that, okay, let's do peace talk, there is no way, in my opinion, that Damascus would engage in peace talks at these circumstances with Israel. First, because of the very difficult situation in Syria, politically, economically, militarily, everything. Syria has to liberate Idlib. Syria has to liberate the north. Syria has to liberate eastern Syria. And lots of places are still under the occupation of whether Turkish forces or Turkish-backed terrorists or American forces and American-backed proxies, right? So when Syria liberates its territories and it turns the table of the economy upside down, and it becomes again developed and thrived economically, and the people feel satisfied, then maybe Syria could like join, just theoretically saying, but from a position of power, from a position of a strength, not from a position of weakness. This is just my understanding of the Syrian foreign policy. I've been following it for a long time, and I don't believe Syria will engage in any peace talks with Israel because of these reasons. And also, there could be a third reason, and this is not my opinion, just saying maybe how in Damascus they think about this. Maybe they're saying the international circumstances is changing. The balance of power is changing in favor of maybe Russia or China. I don't know how they're thinking. And maybe they're saying in Syria that Israel was created for a purpose. So whether the British or the other Western governments, they created Israel as an instrumental country in the region from their perspective in Damascus. So when the US is slowly withdrawing from the Middle East, right? And this is also leaving other Gulf countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE mad at the United States, right? Maybe if the United States is withdrawing from the region and it has other priorities in Central Asia, in Ukraine, in Taiwan, in Far East Asia, maybe this could leave Israel also in a vulnerable situation. And here comes also statements from Israeli officials who say we cannot trust the United States on the long run. Maybe we should also start connecting with Russia, with China, with other growing powers. So this could be true, I don't know. But if you think about it, Israel in the region, they're very clever. And since the creation, they know that their creation was a fruit of a certain international circumstances that in the region. But if the circumstances change, can they preserve the state of Israel? This is also a question I'm sure they're asking in Tel Aviv. And that's why I think, just in my opinion, they have bought nuclear weapons from France, right? And later they are developing it. They have over 200 nuclear weapons. So they know there could be an existential threat on Israel if the international circumstances change, because Israel is the pillars of Israel is based on foreign aid. Lots of it, like main pillars, are based on foreign aid. So if this foreign aid is gone and the balance of power is shifted into other powers, not no more in the hands of the United States and Britain, then maybe, just maybe, Israel would feel threatened, right? So that's why they have nuclear weapons. So this was my analysis on the objections or the commentaries that I received that Assad visited to the UAE, and the UAE has normalized relations. So Syria means it will normalize. I mean, that's too simplistic and too childish, in my opinion. We have to take all this historical context, political context, geographical context, economic, everything, all the factors together, and then see if there would be or maybe peace talks between Syria and Israel. So what do you think, guys? Do you think I am correct? Maybe partially correct. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you think? Let me know your opinion in the comments below, because we have to learn from each other. And a lot of you are living a very important and analytical, critical, like, let's say, analysis in the comments, and I'm reading them, and I thank you very much. And please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me. It really, really helps me. And if you want to support an independent commentary work like I'm doing here, you can become a patron. Link in the description below, and see you next time.